You're in the session on Hawaii 2030-2045, energy economy, and the environment. I'd like to thank you all for coming and welcome you to this session. My name is Carilyn Shon. I'm the administrator for the State Energy Office. You notice it's not straight energy, it's the economy and the environment as well as energy. A lot of times I've been to energy conferences and it's primarily been energy, 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 which is very fascinating, but we are in a larger world, and so we're expanding the topic today. And it's with great pleasure that I'd like to introduce our three speakers. Shasha Fisharaki, who is an expert on, he focuses on LNG, but he is very expert in oil, and I often have discussions with Shasha and his dad about the future of oil and the state of Hawaii, and you'll have Shasha's input. Shasha is the Executive Vice President, Chairman, and Managing Director of FGE Hawaii. They have offices in London, Singapore, Tokyo, Dubai, Honolulu, Los Angeles, Beijing, and Houston. So if you're going to be visiting any of those places, I'm sure Shasha knows those places well, can give you the best restaurants to eat. Another speaker we have is Dr. Eugene Tian, and Eugene is the administrator for the Research and Economic Analysis Division. He's really the state statistician, the state economist, and the author of the data book. And if you're a data geek, you love the volume well, and you have Eugene to thank for that. And our final speaker will be Brad Romaine. Brad is a coastal geologist and coastal management specialist with the University of Hawaii Sea Grant College, and he also works part-time, is on loan to the Department of Land and Natural Resources. So we have a really great lineup of speakers today. Just for your information, the significance of Hawaii in 2030 is because when we began the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative in 2008, 2009, the goal was 70% clean energy by 2030. And the 70% was 40% renewables and 30% efficiency for our electricity generation goal. And in 2015, the legislature made it 100% renewables for generation of electricity because we were doing so well by 2015. So we now have a 100% renewable goal for electricity generation. So those are the significant dates of why 2030 and 2045. Shasha, Eugene, and Brad will be discussing where will we be in terms of energy economy and the environment in those two watershed years, to give you a sense of some of the challenges as well as some of the opportunities that we might have. Therefore, without taking further time, Shasha.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for allowing me to share a few words. I'm going to be speaking about the impact of fossil fuels related to Hawaii's energy and economy in 2030 and 2045. Now, really quickly, just a quick PR plug about FGE. We're a global oil and gas strategic advisory firm. We focus on the downstream oil and natural gas markets. So by downstream, I mean the commercial, the marketing, the pricing issues, looking at the fundamentals of supply and demand. We issue a number of reports talking about our outlook. We don't buy and sell the commodity. We don't explore and produce it. We just provide market intelligence and research. As Carilyn mentioned, actually the company started here in Honolulu in the early 1980s, and now we have offices all around the world. About 80 staff, and we have about 300 clients globally. So, any discussion about what Hawaii is going to look like in 2030 and 2045 has to have a view on the oil price. Whether we like it or not, oil is still a big part of our primary energy mix in this island, and I'll talk about it a bit later. But Hawaii is a small market in the middle of nowhere. We're a price taker, not a price maker. So what happens in other places of the world has big implications for us here. So this is our view of our oil price forecast in real dollars, represented in the red line, and in nominal dollars, represented in the blue line. And basically, long story short, we're going to see an uptick in prices due to some geopolitical situation that's happening with the sanctions on Iran, some supply outages in key producing countries like Venezuela, and then these new IMO regulations, which is an International Maritime Organization. I'll talk about that because that has big implications for Hawaii and our power prices. So I'll get into that in a bit. And we're going to see a drop off in the price and then basically a settling around $65 to $75 a barrel. So this is the kind of numbers you need to think about when you're thinking about oil and any alternative energy sources, as well as the impact on the economy in the mid to long term. Just a couple words about the kind of three phases we've seen as far as oil demand is concerned. We had what the industry likes to dub the golden age of oil demand in the early 1960s to the late 1970s. This is when we had emerging economies growing, more and more vehicles on the road, essentially. And we saw healthy growth rates, almost 6% per annum. Then we had a bit of a slowdown phase in the mid-80s to the mid-2000 or 2010. And this is as economies were maturing, and we had the introduction of alternative energy resources, particularly for power generation, and economies, basically, or energy conservation measures as well. Now we're probably in the last era of growth, and it's barely any growth, if you will. It's half of what we saw in the period before. And we do expect to see oil demand basically cap and peak out somewhere around the 2035, 2040 period. A lot of that will be driven by what's happening in the transportation sector. And as Carilyn mentioned, Hawaii has some strong goals to back out oil in transportation use. And we do expect EVs to begin to take over global gasoline consumption to peak in the early 2030s because of the introduction of EVs and also strong efficiency standards we've seen for existing combustion engines. So that's just kind of setting the scene of what we expect going forward. Now let's bring it back to what that means for Hawaii. So as many in this room are probably aware, Hawaii is the most oil-dependent state in the nation, although we've reduced our reliance quite a bit over the last few years because of our strong move towards alternative energy resources for power generation. If you look at the chart on the upper left-hand side, this is showing Hawaii's foreign imports in billions of dollars. We've looked at a 4-year time series over here. And you can see it's ranged from a low of $3 billion in 2016 to over $5 billion in 2014. But what's interesting is what a large percentage oil plays in the total foreign import bill. Anywhere from 56% to 62%. So all of those dollars that we're spending on importing oil is basically flowing out of the state. So anything we can do to alleviate that dependence filters back into our local economy and should help the average citizen. Now, if we look on the right-hand side, this is just looking at our total oil imports and the green bars. Interestingly, it's gone up, even though we've made a lot of progress with backing out oil in power generation. And that's being driven a lot by transportation, particularly jet fuel demand, and the lower prices, which are represented in the kind of blue dots. So as prices go down, people basically travel or drive more. Where we've seen a lot of success in Hawaii is, of course, backing out thermal fuels, or oil in particular, out of our power generation. And that's the graph on the bottom right-hand side. So this is following basically what the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative is looking at. And we can see that the blue bar is basically oil consumption and power generation dropping off tremendously. So now oil is, instead of 95%, it's about 68% and falling. So we're making good progress as far as increasing the amount of renewables and alternative energy sources for power generation. The big question is what is that going to mean for the transportation sector? We'll talk about that a little later. This is something I wanted to flag for everyone in this room, especially those who live in the state of Hawaii. This is the International Maritime Organization, which is responsible for regulating the shipping industry, the global shipping industry. And basically, their specs for their bunker fuels is going to change tremendously. They're going to go from 3.5%, right here, and go to about 0.5% sulfur. And the reason this matters for somewhere like Hawaii is because the LSFO, the low sulfur fuel oil that we use for our power generation, is the same spec. So basically, a market that was, let's say, 25, 30,000 barrels a day here, if you add Japan and Taiwan, it's called about 200,000 barrel a day market. By 2020, that market's going to be something like 2 million barrels a day. And there's not enough of this stuff out there. So the refiners are going to have to make this and sacrifice other products to make it. So the end result is that the price of this fuel that still drives about 60% of our power generation is going to shoot up tremendously. Instead of it being a discount to crude, it's going to be a 20 to 30% premium. And that means for the people that are still on the grid, they're going to see their power generation prices pop up, or their electricity bills essentially pop up a lot. So anything we can do to try and alleviate our dependence on oil, I know we have the targets by 2030 and 2045, but if we can move that forward, really the 2020 to 2030 period is when we're going to be hit the hardest, and it's going to be the most challenging. So anything we can do to move that target quicker will just benefit the local economy and the citizens of Hawaii. So this is just basically some historical prices, looking at the fuel oil prices. And again, this is what accounts for 60% roughly of our feedstock for our power generation, versus international market prices. So we have Hawaii represented in blue and the international market represented in red. And in most places, the low sulfur fuel oil costs less than oil, than crude, Brent in this case. As I mentioned, these new IMO specs are going to make it at a premium. And Hawaii's LSFO costs are always above the international market because of our distance, shipping, handling costs, a number of things. And that differential has been anywhere from $15 to $20 a barrel. So again, the main point here is that we're going to see the main feedstock as of today increase by 40% in the early 2020s because of something that has nothing to do with Hawaii. So anything we can do to move away from oil sooner rather than later, particularly for power generation and this specific fuel, is a win for the consumers of Hawaii. Let's talk a little about the HCEI and the RPS. So when we look at where we are right now, and Carilyn alluded to these goals earlier, we're making good progress. And we don't see any reason why we can't hit the targets in 2030 and 2045 for power generation. As I mentioned, though, the challenge is going to be the 2020 to 2030 period because of this pricing increase because of IMO for the LSFO specs. Now, the other big challenge is going to be transportation, and I know Hawaii has some big goals as far as ground transportation, trying to make it 100% renewable by 2045. And that is a big goal and one that we should strive hard to do. Whether that happens or not remains to be seen, but it's certainly one that is plausible, particularly if the right incentives are in place for the consumer to go and decide to purchase electric vehicles or for the infrastructure to be in place. Of course, air transportation is a different story. It's going to be difficult to electrify that anytime soon or to find alternative kind of green fuels. I mean, you can do biofuels and you have programs out there for that, but often the net energy gain creating the biofuel is negative when you compare it to the lower emissions stemming from that feed. So just a couple more slides. What's the bad news? Well, in the power sector as of today, simply bringing on more renewables won't necessarily solve the problem. More solar and more wind means more variability, which currently means more backup power, which means more modern turbines. And the Schofield Barracks recently inaugurated 50 megawatt turbine is a good example of that. Batteries may save the day, and we'll talk about that in the next slide, but they aren't really just over the cost of performance just yet, at least for a large scale battery substitution. In the near term, we believe not only more investments will be needed for more responsive equipment, but lighter fuels will still have a role to play, at least for the next 15 to 20 years. I talked about the power sector and the real challenge being in the transport sector, particularly for air transport going forward. But what's the good news? Well, the IMO, while it does pose price problems, will significantly help the environment because the global shipping fleet does release a lot of emissions into the air. At least this is happening at a time when oil prices aren't as robust as they were compared to the 2010 to 2014 period. If we had this new IMO spec coming right now, during that period, we could be looking at fuel oil costs of $200 a barrel, electricity prices of 50 cents a kilowatt hour, or 50 cents. Batteries do continue to improve and get cheaper. We haven't seen a major breakthrough, and they pose their own environmental issues. You can argue about this either way, but there are suggestions that there are major changes on the way, and we do hold out a lot of hope for batteries as far as renewable energy, particularly for power, going forward. We have seen several major corporations working with jet fuel derived from algae. Boeing has a design for an algae-fueled passenger jet, which one can argue is obviously still hydrocarbons, but it might be better than the alternative, which is jet fuel. But it's still many years off. So that kind of concludes and wraps up what I wanted to say. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you guys would have at this time. Thank you.
Let's make a transition to Eugene, our chief economist, who will talk about Hawaii and the economy.
Good afternoon. My name is Eugene Tian. I'm very happy to be invited to talk about Hawaii's economy 2030, 2045. When the organizer asked me to talk about 2030, I thought, oh my goodness. If I'm lucky, I will be in this. We have a very difficult time to walk. But I will spend about 10 minutes to talk to you about Hawaii's economy. I have all tables and charts. There is very little writing. So you can see that I think the number you need to look at is actually the percentage growth at the bottom. So you can see our resident population for the 20 years, 1996, 2016, is only 0.9%. And going forward, is going to be 0.6%, 0.4%. So everything is slowing down. When you look at the visitors, although we have a booming in visitors, in 2 years, we grow from 9 million to 10 million. So that's just 2 years. Last year is 9.4 million. And this year, 2018, is going to be 10 million. So, but it did take us about 18 years to go from 6 million to 7 million. So the average for the 1996-2016 is 1.4%. And this period is about 1.5 is because currently, this year, the visitor growth is projected to be 6%. I think for the first 4 months is already 8.7%. The visitor spending is going to be over 10%. So going forward, it's going to be 0.8%. The hotel rooms occupied is following the same trend. It would be more development like Airbnb. And in the future, will be only 0.8%. If you look at the real personal income, it's going to be 2.1, and 1.9 is diminishing. The job growth also is diminishing. And lastly is the utility jobs containing the electricity is growing because of development of the renewable energy will be slowing down in the last 15 years. So this, I'm going to talk about a little bit about our Hawaii's economy, our population. So the home ownership has something to do with the renewable energy. Our home ownership is one of the lowest. We actually run the 5th lowest. In addition, we are below Washington, D.C., we are below California, New York, and Nevada. So our occupancy, home ownership is only about 57%, roughly. So there are 43% of our residents, they are renting. So there is some implication. Later on, I'm going to talk about the home ownership and renewable energy. We also have some changes in the household type. Household means is one occupied housing unit. Either it is a family or boyfriend, girlfriend, live together, or is a single person. So you can see that in 1960, the 56.2%, they are traditional family type. That means a couple with their own children is a traditional family. But this type of family is decreased to about 18.8%. So now you see that the single person, one person live alone in 1960 is 12.1%, and now the percentage is double, is 24.5%. So one person live in one, most likely is in a condo, and they are unlikely to have renewable energy like the PV system. And also our population are pretty old. I think we are the 8th oldest state in the nation. So our 85, 65 years and older, that's what we call the older age. And currently we are at about 16.6% in 2015, and it's growing faster than the overall population. So by 2030, it will be 22.6%, and slowing down because of the baby boomers. So starting 2011, baby boomers started to retire. By 2030, all the baby boomers. The baby boomers definition is they were born, anybody born from 1946 to 1964. They are baby boomers. And you can see that the single-family homes is pretty much flat since 1980, so it's about 52%. We projected that in the future it will be flat at about 52% because the future development will be more on the condos because of the limited land in Hawaii. There is also implication for single family and renewable energy. Single family tend to have a lot of incentive for renewable energy, and condos, they don't have that kind of incentive like a single family. And de facto population, this de facto population definition is that is the residents on the islands plus the visitors present on a daily basis minus anybody traveling or temporarily out of state. So that's the de facto population. For energy, the de facto population is more meaningful because everybody on the island, they consume energy, not only the residents, but also visitors. You can see that the growth between 1960 to 1990 is 2.2% a year, and it's slowing down to 0.9%. In the future, there will be 0.5%. This is not only for Hawaii residents, but visitors. Growth is also going to slowing down. And now coming to energy. So the energy, actually, the growth of energy has a lot to do with the economy. So we actually are showing the three period in 1991 to 2001. So you can see this is economic stagnation. So Hawaii's economy actually 1991 to 2001 exactly the same. No growth for that 10 years. But the US was booming. Hawaii was a lost child. It didn't follow the US business cycle. And it was booming in the 2007. The economy was booming and the energy consumption also booming. And we had a recession during the 2008 and 2009 period. And after that, the energy consumption was flat. So showing that, indicating the economic growth during this period is a slow growth. It's not only for the nation, it's also for Hawaii. Hawaii's economic growth is slower than the nation. So someone has looked at the history during Obama period, 8 years, and our economy, the US economy, has never reached 3%. So under this administration, I think President Trump was saying we will grow at 4%. But the economy's forecast this year for 2018 is about 2.9%. That's a great rate. And next year about 2.6%. But nobody forecasts 4%, even 3%. So Hawaii's economic growth is going to be about around 1.5%, and maybe for the next 25 years. So you can see the growth in, I put together the GDP growth, or we call it economic growth, and the primary energy. It pretty much follows, although the energy consumption has a lot of fluctuations, but it follows the same cycle. When the economy was good, the red line and the blue line, it goes up as well, but it has some kind of leading. If you look at the visitor for 1990, visitor unit is about 69,000. We have some shopping centers open. So this increase, the sharp increase is actually due to the commercial sector. In the shopping centers, hotel rooms. And this sharp decrease in 2008, the people in Hawaii, we all know that something happened because we have two airline cease operation. One of them is Aloha Airline. And we used to have 3 cruise ships, but they also ceased operation in 2008. Now we still have one, Pride of America, is still operating, but we have only one. So since 2008, our economic growth is kind of slow growth. We look at the primary energy consumption. We look also these period. Even we have the economic stagnation, we still have a decrease in the energy consumption per dollar of real GDP. This is an indication of the efficiency, energy efficient. So when we produce $1 of real GDP, we need about over 7,000 BTUs, and the number is declining. And even during this period, the economy was booming, it's still declining, and now it's declining. So which means we use energy more efficient. We use less energy to generate the same dollar of GDP. And this, in terms of per person means resident population plus visitors is the de facto population. We do see some decrease during the stagnation and some increase during this booming period, and also decrease in the last 10 years or so. And primary renewable energy, so Hawaii actually started the renewable energy since 1960s, but not until the 1980s. We have the sugar industry. We use the sugar gas to generate electricity. Then in the 1990s, it's declining, but now we have the solar, mostly solar, wind, increase. Now the percentage of primary energy, primary renewable in the total primary energy is already overpassed the previous peak when sugar industry was in operation. Some indication about energy and the economy. So you can see that we use Honolulu as example. Our office put Honolulu building permit. You track all the PV installations. So you can see that for these homeowners, if the ownership is higher, like 90%, we have 40% of these homeowners install PV. So the home ownership does have a positive correlation with the renewable energy. And this chart shows that the single family, if area, the small area it is the census tract. We put everything together by census tract. We found out that if the area has more single families, and there are more PVs installed. For example, for if 100% for this area is single family, they have 30 to 40%. They already installed. The state overall, the statewide is about over 14%, including all the condos, over 14% installed the PV. For single families is about 20%. Of course, the higher the income, and people tend to install the PV system. And you can see if the household income is 120, so about 40% they install the PV system. And also traditional families, they have incentive to install the PV. Traditional is married couple with their own children. So you can see the correlation is actually positive. To summarize what I was talking about, in the next 25 years, up to 2030, 2045, the demographic changes in the state will be slow growth in de facto population. That means both resident population and visitors. More aged population. If people getting aged, if by 2030, I don't think I will drive. So we'll use less energy. Will continue to be low in home ownership. So we protected about flat 57%. We have 43% people renting. So the renters is has very low probability installing PV system. And more people will live alone. So those demographic changes has some implication on the renewable side. So energy efficiency will be continue to improve. So the total primary energy consumption in the future will be flat. I think we have a chart show that it's pretty much flat in the past 10 years or so. So in the future will be flat, although the economy will grow at about 1 to 1.5%, but also we have efficiency to grow around the same rate. So the total primary energy demand or consumption will be flat. So because of these, we have a larger rentership, and we have more people live alone, and we have more condos developed. Because of those, I think in the future for Hawaii, for renewable energy, that will be utility scale. They will play an important role for utility scale renewable energy development. I think that concludes my presentation. If
Okay.
you have a question at the end.
Are there any questions for Eugene now that we know that population will be older, living alone? Sounds very questions.
Yes.
Yes.
So what's behind your assumption that the population growth and tourism growth will decline in the future? Is it a global assumption that you're assuming the population is going down, or is it something unique to Hawaii?
It is because we project the long term, it's a longer term. If you look at the short term, of course, the visitor is booming. As I said, you take 2 years from 9 million to 10 million. But if you look at the long term history, it's about only 1.3% for the last 30 years. So in the future, for long term, tourism is not going to grow very fast because we have I think Hawaii Tourism Authority, or the people in the tourism industry, we don't have a term called carrying capacity because it is a target is moving. In the visitor industry, in the past, we thought maybe 9 million is the peak. But in between, we have some new developments. We have, in 2004, we have a new product called timeshare. And now we have over 12,000 units timeshare. So the timeshare attract a lot of visitors. And starting a few years ago, we have another product. It's called Airbnb. So the Airbnb, I think current count is about over 20,000. So those new developments, I think coming to a period, there will be some limitation. One is policy-wide. I think the state may have some tax implications on those. And also, we are short in housing for residents. So there is a lot of pressure for resident housing. So there will be some limitation for visitor use.
I wish it was better news. Excuse me. Thanks for the invite, Carilyn. You have to excuse me. I'm on the back end of a cold here. Still almost recovered, almost there. But anyways, I'm here today to talk about sea level rise, vulnerability, and adaptation in Hawaii. Really about what we're looking at in our coastal zone in Hawaii. If we don't start to really bend the curve of our greenhouse gas emissions downward in the next decade or two, focusing heavily in this talk on the state sea level rise, vulnerability, and adaptation report, which was released in December last year, which I was closely involved in the State Department of Land and Natural Resources. Some examples of the coastal erosion, coastal flooding that we experience here in Hawaii regularly. None of these are storms. These are just annual high waves we get, coastal erosion along our coast. So we expect to see more of this and more severe in the coming decades. 2017, the state legislature and the governor passed Act 32. This was follow-up to 2014 Act 83, the Hawaii Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Initiative. With it, Hawaii became the first state to enact legislation implementing portions of the Paris Climate Agreement. It also established this Hawaii Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Commission, which meets quarterly. It's made up of heads of relevant state legislature committees, heads of different state agencies, and county planning department agencies as well. The commission is intended to provide policy direction, coordination, and planning among agencies, again, across state and county, and establish climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. And the first directive, which was handed down to the State Department of Land and Natural Resources, which I work really closely with through my affiliation with the University of Hawaii Sea Grant Program, was to develop the sea level rise vulnerability and adaptation report. This is the report. It was adopted by the Commission December this past year. It's a technical report, not necessarily an adaptation plan. It's kind of a first look at our detailed vulnerabilities to coastal hazards and sea level rise. But it does also provide 30, 40 kind of detailed actions and recommendations for improving resilience to coastal hazards, which again are going to increase in the coming decades. It was also intended to provide a framework for looking at other climate change impacts. Sea level rise, of course, is not the only thing we're going to be suffering from with climate change, heat stress, health concerns, water resources issues, but hopefully this report can provide a framework for the Commission and others to continue on and look at some of those other impacts. The report is available at this state website, climateadaptation.hawaii.gov. And I should mention it was written by Tetra Tech Incorporated in close cooperation with State Department of Land and Natural Resources, and working really closely with University of Hawaii researchers, especially the UH Coastal Geology Group. There's a companion sea level rise viewer that we developed, so there's a wealth of map data that came out with this report, and too much to print out in the report. So it's now available on this viewer that we created. You can zoom into areas, turn on the different layers that I'll talk about, looking at those different vulnerabilities. And that's, you can get through it through that state climate portal that I just provided, or it's got its own URL here, it's hawaiisealevelriseviewer.org. So let's talk real briefly about some of the sea level rise science. I don't have enough time to go into the climate science in detail. This is a plot of global mean sea level rise taken from averages of tide station data in blue. That's the blue record here from 1900 up to about 1990, when we get into the satellite era, when we have satellite altimetry measuring our sea level heights. And what you see is a doubling of the rate of sea level rise from early in the century to the middle part, and more than doubling again up to the present couple of decades, where we're at our present global mean sea level rate is about 3.2 millimeters per year. It may not sound like a whole lot, but if you extend that out into equivalent of 100 years, that's roughly a third of a meter over the coming century, or about a foot in over the rest of the century. So that's kind of our bottom prediction, the minimum of the sea level rise we expect to see through the rest of this century. Of course, we do expect the curve to continue to accelerate for some time, that rate increasing. What's causing the sea level rise? It's two primary contributions. The first is thermal expansion of the water. You heat up water, it does expand, and that raises the water column a certain amount. The other is ice melt from our glaciers, continental glaciers, and ice sheets, particularly on Greenland and Antarctica. And there was some interesting news that just came out today from Nature, a paper New York Times covered as well, that the rate of ice loss on Antarctica is increasing, is accelerating. So, and you can see that in this plot as well. The amount of thermal expansion is somewhat linear, but we do see this component of added meltwater increasing, accelerating up towards the present. The science on sea level rise and climate change as a whole is evolving very rapidly. Even in the 3 years we were doing this state sea level rise report, it was hard to keep up with the science and to keep the report current. So some of the important key things that really continue to develop is the science on the ice sheets on Antarctica and Greenland. Again, the report I mentioned, a lot of the other science coming out is showing that the higher sea level rise forecasts, some of the more extreme end forecasts maybe are more likely than we originally thought. We're seeing a lot of these tongues, ice sheets starting to accelerate off of southern Greenland and particularly western Antarctica. 2015, NASA came out with a statement basically saying that we're locked into at least 3 feet of sea level rise just given the greenhouse gases and the heat that we've added to the atmosphere and oceans, we're locked into at least 3 feet of sea level rise. The question with that is the timing. Does that happen at the end of the century? Is it earlier? Can we really begin to hold off our greenhouse gas emissions and push it into the latter half, into the next century? So here's some of the recent forecasts from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration from a 2017 report. Their Sweet et al. Paper, Global and Regional Sea Level Rise Scenarios for the United States. This study looked at a range of projections from recent peer-reviewed scientific literature. And you can see they provide 6 different forecasts here, from a low scenario up to an extreme scenario. And I put them here in table form as well. And basically what they show, looking at the dates we wanted to look at for this session, 2030, looking at, I'm going to kind of ignore the low projections here because it doesn't include any acceleration. That basically is a linear projection out from the current global rate. But looking at the kind of their intermediate low to the extreme scenario, looking at about 5 to 9 inches of sea level rise by 2030, only a decade away, with an intermediate projection of about 6 inches. 2045, looking at about 8 to 20 inches of sea level rise with an intermediate projection of about 1 foot. And then looking at the end of the century, that's where things really get variable. There's a lot of uncertainty as we start to go out to the end of the century, and that has a lot to do with the path that we end up taking in greenhouse gas emissions, as well as how these ice sheets behave in reaction to the warming that we put into the atmosphere and the oceans. But they provide a range of between 20 inches and 98 inches. And can't do quick math, 98 inches is about 8.5 feet at the most extreme end by 2100. So it was really alarming. That's a low probability, but as they say, a plausible outcome, in a worst case scenario. So I want to just real briefly go through the mapping, modeling that Sea Level Rise Report did. There's three types of chronic impacts that we modeled and expect to happen with sea level rise. And this was done by the UH Coastal Geology Group. The first is this passive flooding. This is just kind of a first look at areas that will be below sea level at high tide at a certain elevation of sea level rise. This is looking at the Mapunapuna area here on Oahu, past downtown, with 3.2 feet of sea level rise. And this is an area, if you've seen on the news, that does get flooded out when we have our highest tides. So we expect that to get worse and worse in the coming decades. So that's the first model. There's a picture of Mapunapuna from last summer when we had some high water levels. Of course, we have high waves here in Hawaii. Everybody comes here to surf, right? But it's also a hazard for our coastlines. And so that's the second model we want to do. We want to look at wave overwash on our coastline because that passive flooding doesn't include that kind of dynamics we have on our shorelines. So this is an example of the model. This is West Maui, the highway, Manoa Pi'ilani Highway going out to Lahaina. What wave overwash, an annual average highest wave event, will look like with 3.2 feet of sea level rise overwashing that road. And this is actually a section of the road that does have overwash problems now. So again, stressing that the problems we're having now, we already have serious coastal hazard problems. These are only expected to get worse. So we need to start thinking about maybe moving some of these roads and some of our infrastructure. The third model, again, looking at hazards that we're already facing, is coastal erosion. And we have really good data on the historical changes that are going on our beaches. We know that about 70% of our beaches on Kauai and Oahu and Maui have this chronic shoreline retreat going on. So the coastal group used that data and an engineering model to project hazard areas for coastal erosion out into the future. And that's looking at Sunset Beach. That red line is the erosion hazard area with 3 feet of sea level rise. And some of the erosion we had this winter at Sunset Beach where the bike path failed. So Tetra Tech, the state's consultant, took these three models, combined them into a sea level rise exposure area that they use for vulnerability assessment purposes. And we abbreviate that as the SLR-XA, sea level rise exposure area. Here's an example of the results for that combined SLR-XA for Waikiki, 1.1 feet. And given the NOAA projections, that's somewhere between 2030 for their extreme projection, or as late as, or maybe around 2050 from their intermediate projection. So what you see is just some minor flooding through storm drains, the backshore, overwashes some of the beaches, overtopping some sections of the Alawai Canal. Excuse me. And this map comes from the Hawaii Sea Level Rise Viewer, again available at that website. Here it is at 3.2 feet, which we expect sometime in the latter half of the century. And you can begin to see we've reached a critical elevation. We're really overtopping a lot of the coastal infrastructure, the drainage systems, and the shoreline. That boundary between 2 and 3 feet of sea level rise is a pretty critical threshold for, particularly for Oahu, given our coastal geography and just the elevations at our shorelines. And then they took the sea level rise exposure area and did a vulnerability assessment, and basically taking the property values, the buildings and the land, the values from the parcel data, the tax map key data, and upscale those to 1 hectare grid cells that you see here, the color coding there being the dollars in potential loss at that sea level height. Now this is all assuming no adaptation measures. It's assuming current property values, even though we're looking out in the future. And those red squares, over 50 million potential impacts with sea level rise in those areas. The orange ones, 10 million and up. So some of the summary results from the State Sea Level Rise Report, at 3.2 feet of sea level rise, it could be as much as 19 billion in loss in land structures. 13 billion alone of that is coming from just from Oahu, given the dense development on our shoreline. 116 miles of road potentially flooded. A real vulnerability for us is our critical artery roads coming in and out of our coastal towns. Almost 7,000 structures flooded. 20,000 people potentially displaced from homes and buildings if no adaptation is done. The study did not look at dollar impacts to infrastructure, such as roads. State DOT did put out a number recently, another potential $19 billion in coastal highways, potentially at risk of sea level rise. And that was kind of just the back of the envelope calculation, so we need some more better numbers on our critical infrastructure vulnerabilities. Sea level rise does not stop at 3 feet. We do expect it to go beyond that, whether that's within this century or the next century, but the report did include some maps like this that compare the 3.2 foot sea level rise exposure area in blue and a 5 foot sea level rise exposure area in pink. And for Oahu, 5 foot compared to 3 foot exposure area is about 36% increase in the flooded area. The report did provide a range of recommendations. Some of the key ones, there was 30-some actions that the report recommends, and the Climate Commission continues to meet quarterly, and groups of us are kind of working out, prioritizing the recommendations. One of the main goals of the Climate Commission is to come back and develop a legislative agenda, to try to address some of the recommendations through legislation and other actions in January, this new state legislature. But some of the key recommendations of the report are to begin planning for 3 feet of sea level rise after mid-century. So anything that kind of has a lifespan into the second half of the century, which really is most of our existing development, certainly any new development. So we really need to start taking that exposure area seriously and consider even higher sea level rise scenarios for critical infrastructure, power stations or some of our highways, the things that will be around for longer than that, that need to be better adapted to higher sea level heights. Some of the other things, things like developing shoreline protection and preservation priorities. We've already lost a lot of our beaches. About 13 miles of beach have already been lost to seawalls and development on the shoreline. If we want to have beaches in the coming decades, we've got to start prioritizing some of these that we're going to save, and that might mean moving some of our development back in some areas. And then overall, the report recommends recognizing the sea level rise exposure area is kind of an overlay, a planning overlay as a hazard area. Anytime doing an environmental assessment, for example, or strategic planning, community development planning, things like that, begin to utilize this data for planning. So thank you very much. If we have some time for questions, I'd be happy to answer some if we do. And there's that state climate website again, if you want to access the report. There's a lot more on climate change information, and you can access the sea level rise viewer through that state portal as well.
I have a question. Do you think the $19 billion for infrastructure and land, is that a conservative or a very upper end estimate?
I don't know exactly where that number came from. I have heard that it was just kind of a back of the envelope number from state DOT. You know, I can answer that the numbers we provided with the state sea level rise report were certainly conservative. You know, it's a minimum estimate, if anything, you know, because it's in present day dollars. It doesn't include other economic impacts, losses to business, tourism revenue that could result in this. So overall, I think we're looking at conservative numbers across all these projections. Yeah, in the back. Yeah.
Thanks. Really interesting. Did your study include saltwater intrusion and freshwater resources?
Oh, so groundwater intrusion into aquifers. No, not directly. It does model areas that will become essentially wetlands where the groundwater will crop out on the coastal plain. But it does not study the intermixing of saltwater with the freshwater lens that underlies a lot of our coastal plain. There is, I think, some work going on in that. One interesting, now you may be asking like in regards to drinking water resources and all that, I'm guessing, is that correct?
Yes.
I think it's not my expertise, but I think we access most of our drinking water from higher elevations up in the hills and mountains. I don't think we're pulling a lot of drinking water from the very low-lying coastal plain. But the one thing that is interesting is that we have typically this lens of fresh water that's above sea level, that has a gradient that goes down the coast. Well, that will rise up to sea level as well. So that's another place where these models are somewhat conservative, because there is models like that out there for Honolulu. Some studies have been done that show how that groundwater will crop out above sea level with sea level rise, but that wasn't included in the state sea level rise.
You talked about mitigation measures and you had some recommendations, but in your view, what are the one or two most important ones that we as a state can do?
I think, you're talking about greenhouse gas?
No, I'm sorry, about for sea level rise.
For sea level rise?
Yeah.
I think it needs to be really place-based, and there's areas we're going to need to protect and armor and build higher seawalls. Airport, Honolulu Harbor, easy examples for that. But when I say place-based, I think there's some places where we might need to. A lot of our coastlines here, particularly on Oahu, Kauai, somewhat on Maui, have low-lying coastal plains with old beach deposits, old dune deposits we've built over. There's a chance to maintain beaches in some of these areas, and this is just my plug for trying to conserve beaches, working with the State Office of Conservation of Coastal Lands, seeing some of our beaches lost. I think we need to also prioritize some of these places where we want to still have beaches and wetlands and other coastal environments. And it's going to mean making difficult choices to pull back in some of these areas. So, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach when we're adapting, mitigating from sea level rise. It needs to be very site-specific and community-driven as well, I think. That's good.
With the loss of our beaches or shifting shoreline, has there been any economic analysis about how this affects the tourism state?
And that's a great question. Not enough. There's been a study at Waikiki. I think it found that the beach was worth $2.5 billion. I think that was a year to the state's economy. And that was used to justify a big beach nourishment project that was done at Waikiki, in part in 2012. It was a huge value. We don't have good numbers like that from other beaches. It would be great to know what our North Shore beaches are worth to our economy. But it's difficult too. I mean, some of these natural resources, public access, places like the North Shore are Oahu's playground too. And Kailua, Lanikai, places like that, maybe, the point I'm getting to, maybe some of these resources are invaluable too. It's hard to put a number on natural and recreation resources sometimes as well. But maybe our economists can answer that better. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to thank all three of our speakers, Shasha Fesharaki, Eugene Tian, and Brad. And thank you all for attending this afternoon. I know the slides were very chock full of really good information. So if you're interested, give us a couple of weeks and Google the State Energy Office. We'll have it on our website, and we've also been recording this session. So we will also have it on our website. I'm not sure where our specialists will put it on the website, but we will have it up. Give it a couple of weeks. You can see that we are a really precious state with beautiful climates, and beautiful natural settings. And it's important not only for our tourism industry, but most importantly for us who live here, how we care for our state. And there's nothing like walking on the beach when you're a kid with your toes in the sand. And we hope that we have that for future generations. And so it's important that we all play our part in making sure our community, our geography, the state that we love remains as the state as we remember it. Not always the same, but nevertheless these precious resources are preserved. And therefore we all have a part to make sure we try to play our part in using less, keeping the greenhouse gases down. If you don't need it, don't throw it away. And try not to be a throwaway society. Try to conserve, try to be smart and wise about how we use everything, all of our resources. And so I'll get off my soapbox, but thank you all for coming and for showing the interest in where our state will be in 2030 and 2045 in terms of energy, the economy, and the environment. Thank you.